control the vertigo.
Welcome to Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I am your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, science fiction, and the best of mystery suspense anthology shows and series on TV. Join me as we slip through the cracks of reality to approach the extremes of experience, where we can peruse the stories and art of a sinister fairground of strange and wonderful rides. And now we go on to the show that is the focus of this particular episode. Welcome to this episode of Anthologic with host Mark. Today we are covering the first episode of Boris Karloff's thriller. Now this show ran, I think it was 78 episodes for 2 seasons. 67 episodes for 2 seasons, starting in 1960 to 61 and then 61-62 on NBC. Hosted by Boris Karloff, and an interesting sounding one because the IMDb describes it as a mix of macabre horror tales and suspense thrillers. And indeed, the first episode I'll be discussing in more detail is a suspense thriller. And in many respects, it felt very similar to Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and apparently it was meant to be kind of a knockoff of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, so it kind of makes sense. However, my interest was very piqued with this one because it was on my radar. I knew about it, never seen an episode. But when I was doing some research, I did come across in the book Danse Macabre by Stephen King, which is one of my favourite books by Stephen King. It's a non-fiction book about the nature of horror. It talks about horror in movies, radio, TV, literary, and so on. Stephen King puts his case across very well. He's very interesting. I believe he does know what he's talking about with most of these genres. I'm not so sure about the movies. I'm not sure his judgment is entirely sound on movies, I have to say. Though the movies he covers in the book are very good, but I think his horror movie antenna is not quite the same as mine. Things he likes, I think, are okay, and vice versa. So it's kind of tricky, this. However, he does spend a fair bit of time talking about this TV show, and it very much intrigued me what he said. He does describe it initially as, the first 12, 13 episodes are basically, it's an Alfred Hitchcock Presents kind of knockoff. But he says, but then a certain producer left, and it kind of took a life of its own, and it became much more straight horror. So he said he estimates roughly 56 of the 78 episodes are straight up horror, and the rest are sort of suspense thrillers. And he says something like, this really is a one-of-a-kind series. There's really nothing like it for straight-up horror. Now, he wrote this book in 1985, so that, lots in horror has happened in terms of TV since then, so let's bear that in mind. But he also contextualised it. He said this was an era of much more violent TV, bizarrely. For example, The Untouchables, the fairly violent Untouchables was airing. Peter Gunn was airing. And he kind of accounts for, then there was a series of high-profile assassinations and more significant violence going on in the real world. He talks about JFK, Martin Luther King, and he equates the rise of such violence to the softening of TV. He describes it as becoming syrupy, and he says the kind of thing we got once it reached a certain point, is it slid down the tubes with a hearty cry of nanu nanu. That's how he describes it. He basically says syrupy sitcoms kind of took over from the hard-boiled action stuff that was being aired. I don't know, because I haven't seen those other shows, but it's kind of an interesting insight into someone who lived through that era and writes about it in a very interesting way. And he also describes some of the episodes, and they sound really intriguing. I'm so intrigued, I have to say, that I got a feeling I might slot this in as a replacement when I finally finish The Night Gallery or The Outer Limits. Twilight Zone's got so many episodes, I think that one's just going to run around. But at some point, I will get through all the episodes of The Night Gallery or Outer Limits, and at which point I will swap in a new one. Now, I always had in mind something from the 80s, something like Tales from the Crypt or Tales of the Unexpected, maybe. But Thriller really starting to feel to me, given Stephen King's recommendation, might be the one I actually slot in. And I wouldn't have said that before reading all this stuff. And in fact, on the Wikipedia, it doesn't particularly sell it that way. And the first episode I'm going to talk about is a suspense thriller. It's not a horror at all. So there's some interesting stuff going on in this one, and I'm kind of looking forward to it. Now, these episodes are, certainly the episode I watched was about 50 minutes. It's a fairly long one. It's not half an hour show, it's an hour show, certainly for season 1. And I haven't read anywhere it's any different. Interesting music by various people, but including Jerry Goldsmith, and had various fairly famous people in it. For example, the one I'm talking about tonight has Leslie Nielsen in. It's kind of interesting. Later ones has William Shatner, Elizabeth Montgomery, John Carradine, those kind of people you know. So that's kind of interesting, I think. Yes, so King, as I say, King wrote this in 1981, so you've got to accept this was a 1981 statement. He considered this the best of its kind. It's peerless, so that's kind of cool, right? Right, let's get on to the episode we're talking about tonight. It's called The Twisted Image, directed by Arthur Hiller. Now that name rings a bell. He's a director who I think has made some films we'd all know, but I can't tell you what they are off the top of my head. Maybe I'll Google it as I'm talking. Now, it's based on a novel by William O'Farrell and adapted by James P. Kavanagh. Aired on September the 13th, 1960. Now, Leslie Nielsen playing this in a fairly straight way, which he did in those roles from this era. If for example, if you've seen The Forbidden Planet, he plays a sort of, something pre-Star Trek, that kind of vibe, a ship carrying men exploring the universe, and he's in that. I think he's the captain in that, and again, he plays it straight. So he's in this, he's blonde in this, it's fairly blonde and grey in later life. And unfortunately, he's married happily. This woman kind of starts to obsess with him. Now, this woman's played by Natalie Trundy. I recognised her face, Googled it. She's been in some of the Planet of the Apes films. Interestingly, not the same character. She appeared in various of the movies, but often as a different character. I certainly remember her from Beneath the Planet of the Apes as one of the mutants. She's got a kind of quite striking face, striking pair of eyes, and they use those eyes. They introduce her by, look at those eyes, those beautiful eyes, watching him. You know, there's all this going on. And she becomes obsessed with Leslie Nielsen, whose name is Alan Patterson. He kind of brushes it off, explains he's married, and she suggests a drink, and he thinks it's kind of just, a friendship thing, but she kind of gets obsessed. She starts talking about him leaving his wife and stuff like that. He puts her off. But she keeps persisting. The wife gets rattled by this, even though he keeps explaining what's going on. And she's saying things like this, no smoke without fire, what's going on, and all this, that, and the other. It's very odd. But not only does he have to contend with this, someone else, a man who works in his company, is also obsessed with him, but obsessed in that he wants his life. Indeed, he goes out with the girl and sort of says, what's he got that I haven't got? And this develops in a rather tragic way. Let's put it that way. In addition, he starts to pretend to be this man, using his name, using his job, telling people about what he does. And in fact, he goes to this club where there's hostesses, and this is not sleazy. This is just a place where people hang out, and the hostesses will dance with people and stuff like that, dance with men. And she starts explaining what she is, and then he starts telling her all this, and she's like, "Yeah, I know a phony when I see one. You're a phony, dude. You buy me a couple of drinks, I'm not. You think you own me, forget it. I don't believe a word you're saying." So he gets spotted straight away. And so on. This plot develops. It's kind of interesting. Not great. It's an okay kind of piece of suspense. And it is very much akin to a weaker episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Presents, I would say. So not an auspicious start, but an okay one is how I would put this. It's worth a look. But no more. But what I've read from Stephen King talking about this series, really induced me to try and sort of watch more episodes of this. Kind of interested. I just looked up some stuff about Arthur Hiller. He is an actor. I believe he looks like the actor that was in Close Encounters near the end, but I'm not sure it is him. But for example, he collaborated a lot with Paddy Chayefsky, the great screenwriter, and Neil Simon. Some of the films he directed was Silver Streak, the comedy Silver Streak, Outrageous Fortune, the quite intense ones, The Hospital, and The Man in the Glass Booth. So he had a range from drama to comedy. It looks like he's kind of interested in that. So he directed Love Story. So that's kind of, I mean, it's super cheesy, but it was extremely popular. So that's kind of interesting, right? I'm trying to look at some of the others that jump out at me. There's lots you kind of heard of or not, but I think I've mentioned the ones. He also directed the other Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder comedy, See No Evil, Hear No Evil. So how about that? Yes, reasonable director, and it looks like he directed several episodes of Thriller too. Now, I have to also mention that there are other shows called Thriller. There was a British show in the 70s called Thriller, whose creative head, I believe was Dennis Spooner, the guy that was kind of involved with one of the guys that were involved in the Avengers. But that was very British, very stagey, an interesting and creepy show, but let's not get mixed up with this, or indeed Michael Jackson's video. Boris Karloff introduced all of the episodes, I believe, and actually starred in 5 of them. And apparently the 5 he's in are particularly good. His presence really elevates them somewhat, so that's worth knowing. But there's a lot going on in this in terms of gothic horror and stuff like that. So I'm going to recommend it based on watching one episode and what Stephen King says, actually. And as I say, I may well cycle it into my more frequent watch when one of my other bigger shows has finished. I think Thriller's moved to the top of my list on that account. And I had a few up there, but more from the 80s actually. But this sounds intriguing. I also had Alfred Hitchcock Presents up there, which even though that's more suspense than Thrillers and just unusual, is a certain quality to it that I really like. So I find that quite a good show too. There was something about this early 60s era producing these great anthology shows. It's a rich time. Okay, so I'm going to wind it up there. So a recommend for me for Thriller, not necessarily for the episode I watched, but for the series as a whole. But before I go, I ask, is anybody out there?
We now return control of your television set to you. Until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to